Hey, my name is James Brooks. I'm 29, and for the past 3 years, I've been working the night shift as a janitor at the Hale Group headquarters in downtown Chicago. The job is simple enough: push a cart through empty hallways, wipe down conference rooms after the executives leave, change trash bags, clean glass, and disappear before the suits come back in the morning. After a while, you learn that the lower your profile, the safer you are. People like me don't get noticed unless something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong, we're usually the first ones they look at. That night, the snow came down hard. Chicago winters can be brutal, but this one felt personal. The wind slammed against the windows on the 78th floor and turned the glass into a sheet of white. I had finished the South Wing early and was counting down the minutes until I could clock out and drive back to my small rented house in Aurora. I lived alone. No family nearby, no one waiting. On nights like this, most people just wanted to get home and stay there. I was pushing the cart past the executive elevator bank when I saw her. At first, I thought it was some drunk employee who had stayed too late after a company party. Then I got closer and recognized the black dress, the expensive coat soaked from melted snow, the single high heel lying on its side. Victoria Hale, CEO of the entire Hale Group, daughter of Richard Hale, the man who built this building and most of the others like it in the city. She was on the marble floor, one arm stretched out like she had tried to catch herself and failed. Her face was pale, her body shaking in short, violent tremors. I stopped. A man in my position has rules he doesn't break. Don't touch the executives, don't get involved in their problems. Don't let the cameras catch you doing anything that could be twisted later. If I called security, there would be a report. If I called an ambulance, there would be questions. If anything happened to her between now and morning, the night janitor who found her would be the first name on the list. I was nobody. She was the woman whose name was on the building. I started to back away, then she made a small sound, half groan, half breath, and tried to push herself up. Her arm slipped. She went down again. Her eyes opened for a second, unfocused, and I saw the fever in them. She was burning up. I should have kept walking, I told myself that. I even took one more step back. But when she whispered, "Please, don't call anyone," the words came out so small and so scared that I couldn't move. I knelt beside her. "Ms. Hale," I said quietly, "can you hear me?" Her eyes found me, but they didn't really see me. Her lips were cracked. She was fighting to stay conscious. "I'm going to call security," I told her, "or an ambulance. You need help." The second I said security, her hand shot out and grabbed my sleeve. Even burning with fever, her grip was strong. "No," she breathed. Please, don't let my father know." I looked at her, then at the empty hallway. The security rounds came through every 40 minutes. If I called anyone, by morning, the whole building would know Victoria Hale had collapsed in her own tower. If I didn't and something happened to her, I would be the one who walked away. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The wind sounded like it was trying to peel the windows off the building. She was shaking so hard now that her teeth clicked together. She had asked me not to call anyone. She had looked at me like I was the only person left in the world who might listen. I took off my jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "I'm going to get you out of here," I said. "Stay with me." She didn't answer, but she didn't fight me either. I used my employee key card to call the service elevator, the one without cameras in the back corner of the floor. I half-carried, half-walked her down the service corridor and into the basement garage. My old sedan was parked in the farthest spot, the one nobody wanted because it was always cold. I got her into the passenger seat, turned the heater on full blast, and pulled out into the storm. The roads were almost gone. Snow piled against the curbs and blew across the lanes in thick, white sheets. I drove slower than I ever had in my life, both hands locked on the wheel, eyes straining to see the taillights in front of me. Victoria drifted in and out beside me. Sometimes she mumbled about meetings and board members and her father's voice. Sometimes she went quiet for so long, I had to glance over to make sure she was still breathing. I didn't know where she lived. I didn't dare take her to a hospital after what she had begged me not to do. The only place I could think of that felt safe was the small house I rented in Aurora, the one with the peeling blue paint and the wooden porch that creaked in the wind. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it was mine, and nobody would look for her there. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the snow was already covering the windshield. I got her inside, laid her on the old couch in the living room, and pulled the thickest blanket I owned over her. She was still shaking. I put a glass of water on the coffee table, found a clean towel, and started wiping the sweat from her forehead. Then I sat in the armchair across from her and stayed there. I didn't sleep. Around 4 in the morning, her fever spiked again. She twisted under the blanket and made a sound that scared me. I almost called 911 right then. Instead, I kept changing the cool cloths on her forehead and talking to her in a low voice, telling her she was going to be all right, even though I had no idea if that was true. Slowly, the shaking eased. Her breathing settled into something closer to sleep. Outside, the storm kept howling against the windows. Inside, the old heater clicked and groaned, and the only other sound was her breathing, and the occasional creak of the floorboards when I shifted in the chair. I watched her sleep on my couch and felt something strange settle in my chest. She was Victoria Hale. She ran a company that employed thousands of people. She lived in a world so far above mine that most days I never even saw the floor she worked on. But right now, feverish and alone on a stranger's secondhand sofa in the middle of a blizzard, she was just a woman who had needed someone to not walk away. I had not walked away. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know what her father would do when he found out, or what it would cost me. All I knew was that when I looked back at this night, I would still choose the same thing. Because sometimes the only choice that feels like a choice at all is the one that lets you keep looking at yourself in the mirror the next morning. I sat there until the sky outside started to turn gray. The snow had finally slowed. Victoria's face had lost some of its gray color. She was still asleep, one hand curled loosely against her cheek like a child. I stayed in the chair, listening to the heater and the quiet, and waited for whatever came next. I woke up in the armchair with a stiff neck and the gray light of morning leaking through the blinds. The storm had passed some time before dawn. The world outside was quiet under a thick blanket of snow, and the only sound in the house was the low hum of the heater and the occasional shift of the old floorboards. Victoria was still on the couch. She had turned onto her side during the night, one hand tucked under her cheek. The fever had broken. Her breathing was even now, and some of the color had returned to her face. She looked smaller than I remembered from the pictures I had seen in the company newsletters. Without the sharp suit and the armor of assistance and security, she just looked tired. I stood up slowly so I wouldn't wake her and went into the kitchen. It was small, barely big enough for one person to turn around without bumping into something. I started the coffee and pulled out the ingredients for pancakes. It was the only thing I knew how to make that didn't come out of a box. While the pan heated, I kept glancing toward the living room. Part of me still couldn't believe she was actually there. I heard the couch creak, then soft footsteps on the wooden floor. She appeared in the doorway wearing the same black dress from the night before, wrinkled now, her hair loose and messy around her shoulders. She had found her other shoe somewhere. She looked nothing like the woman who gave quarterly updates on the 78th floor. She looked like someone who had survived a bad night and wasn't sure what came next. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I don't know what to say." I set a mug on the counter and poured coffee into it. "You don't have to say anything. You were sick. I helped. That's all." She stepped further into the kitchen and looked around. Her eyes moved over the old wooden table, the two mismatched chairs, the small pot of basil on the windowsill that I kept forgetting to water. She didn't say anything about how small it was or how different it must have been from what she was used to. "This is your house?" she asked. "Yeah, not exactly a 5-star hotel, but it's warm." A very small smile touched her mouth. It was the first time I had seen her smile. I put a plate of pancakes in front of her and sat down across the table with my own coffee. She picked up the fork, hesitated for a second like she wasn't sure what to do with it, then took a bite. She stopped chewing and looked at me. "These are really good." "Secret is cheap vanilla and not burning them," I said. She laughed under her breath. The sound made the kitchen feel less strange. We ate without talking much at first. The only noise was the scrape of forks and the wind still moving through the trees outside. After a while, she set her fork down and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug like she was trying to absorb the heat. "I've been working 18-hour days for the last 3 weeks," she said. "The board wants to push an expansion that's too aggressive. My father wants to protect me from it while also making sure I never make a decision without checking with him first. Every meeting, every number, every mistake gets used as proof that I can't do this without him holding the leash. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. She looked down into her coffee. If he had found me last night, he wouldn't have asked what I needed. He would have asked who let it happen and who needed to be removed. With him, love and control got mixed up a long time ago. I stopped being able to tell them apart. I pushed the sugar bowl toward her even though she hadn't asked for it. Sounds exhausting. She looked at me like no one had said something that simple about her life in years. It is. When we finished eating, I told her I would drive her back to the city. The roads were clear enough now. She offered to pay for gas for my time, for anything that would make the night feel less like charity. I shook my head. Don't turn this into a transaction. She went still. I just wanted to thank you. I know, but I didn't help you so I could get something back. On the drive into Chicago, she was quiet for long stretches. The city slowly appeared through the melting snow, gray and sharp against the white. When I pulled up in front of her building, she didn't get out right away. She turned in the seat and looked at me. James, she said, are you sure you don't want me to do anything for you? I'm sure, just get some rest. She nodded once, then stepped out onto the cleared sidewalk. I watched her walk toward the glass doors until they closed behind her. Then I drove home. 3 days passed. I went back to work, did my shifts, came home, slept, and tried not to think about the woman who had slept on my couch. On the third evening, I had just finished a late dinner and was getting ready to head back to the building for my shift when someone knocked on the door. Victoria stood on the porch in a long cream-colored coat, her hair pulled back neatly, her face tight with something that looked like worry. My father wants to meet you, she said without any small talk. I leaned against the doorframe. He knows? Security footage from the garage, keycard logs. His people checked everything. I told him the truth, but he doesn't believe in simple stories. He wants to know what you want. I rubbed a hand over my jaw. I already told you what I want. I didn't want you freezing to death on the floor. I know that, she said, but he doesn't think the way normal people do. To him, everyone wants something, money, access, leverage, a story they can sell. I studied her face. Behind the calm CEO expression, there was real fear that I was about to get pulled into something I couldn't handle. What happens if I say no? She tightened her grip on her car keys. He'll decide for himself, and my father's decisions tend to make other people's lives difficult. I was quiet for a moment. I knew exactly what I was looking at. If I went to that meeting, I was stepping into their world, the one where every word got weighed and every action got questioned, and a guy who cleaned offices at night was automatically assumed to be after something. But I also remembered her on my couch, burning with fever, asking me not to let her father know. Not because she hated him, because she was afraid of what his version of love would do to both of us. Do you want me to go? I asked. She looked surprised, like she wasn't used to anyone asking her what she actually wanted. I want you to tell the truth. I want him to see that there are still people who help without keeping score. Maybe that's naive, but I want him to see it. I nodded. All right, I'll meet him. She let out a breath she had been holding. It didn't completely erase the worry in her eyes. I won't say anything pretty to him, I told her. I'll just tell him what happened. And I'm not going to apologize for helping you. Victoria looked at me for a long time. That's exactly why I want you to meet him. The next evening, I drove my old sedan through the northern suburbs until the houses got bigger and the gates got taller. The Hale estate sat behind black iron fencing and a long driveway that curved past frozen fountains and snow-covered lawns. I had put on the only suit I owned, the one I had worn to my mother's funeral. It pulled a little across the shoulders, but it was clean. A man in a dark uniform met me at the door and led me through rooms that smelled like old wooden money. Richard Hale was waiting in a study lined with books and a real fire burning in the fireplace. He looked exactly like the photos I had seen in the company lobby, only older and sharper. He didn't stand when I came in. He just gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit, Mr. Brooks. I sat. My back stayed straight. He studied me for a long moment before he spoke. I want to hear everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. So I told him. I told him about finding Victoria on the marble floor, about the fever, about her begging me not to call security or him. I told him about the service elevator in the drive through the storm and how I had put her on my couch because I didn't know where else to take her. I told him about the pancakes the next morning and how I had driven her home and refused any kind of payment. I didn't make myself sound noble, I just said what had happened. When I finished, Richard leaned back in his chair. What do you want? Nothing. He tilted his head slightly, like he was examining a piece of faulty equipment. Everyone wants something. I want to keep my job, pay my rent on time, and stay out of other people's problems. That's it. You took my daughter home when she was unable to protect herself. Do you understand how that could be interpreted? I understand, but she was burning up and scared and alone in a snowstorm. I chose what felt right instead of what felt safe for me. His eyes narrowed. You think you're honorable? No, I think I'm a person. The fire popped in the silence that followed. Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the white garden. My daughter says you refused money. Because I'm not selling kindness. He turned back to me. You are either very principled or very stupid. Could be both. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile that made me feel better. Before I left, he said, Victoria rarely speaks well of anyone. She spoke well of you. Don't make me regret allowing this to continue. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't a blessing either. The trouble started 2 days later. My landlord called and told me the rent was going up $300 starting next month. Completely legal, he said. Just market adjustment. The timing felt too clean. Then my supervisor at the building started doing random checks on my work. A missed spot in one conference room became an official write-up. The day after that, my brakes started making a grinding sound on the way home. The mechanic said it could have been the weather, but I stopped believing in coincidences. I called Victoria from the parking lot outside my house. She was quiet for a long time after I told her what was happening. It's my father, she said finally, or someone working for him. He's applying pressure to see how you'll react. What am I supposed to do about it? Let me stop him. I thought about it for a few seconds. Not yet. James, he's making your life harder on purpose. I know. But if you step in right now, he'll decide I need you to protect me. I don't want to enter your world as someone who has to be shielded. She sighed. You don't have to prove anything to him. Maybe not. But I need to prove something to myself. I need to know I won't let powerful people decide who I am. After that call, Victoria started coming to my house on weekends. She never made a big announcement about it. She would just show up with a bag of takeout or a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She would kick off her heels at the door, sit at my kitchen table, and talk like a regular person instead of a CEO. We talked about the board meetings that wore her down and the way her father still treated her like she was one mistake, away from needing to be rescued. I told her about working nights for years and how most people never looked at the person pushing the cleaning cart. I told her about my mother, who used to say that being poor wasn't shameful, but losing your self-respect was. Victoria listened like she was actually interested in the answers instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. One night she sat at the table with a cup of tea between her hands and watched the snow fall outside the window. Here I don't have to perform, she said quietly. There's no audience here. She smiled at that. That's why I like it. I was starting to feel something for her that went beyond concern. It scared me more than Richard Hale ever could. Not because she was rich and I wasn't, because her world had the power to destroy someone like me with nothing more than a rumor. The rumor arrived on a Tuesday. A blurry photo of the two of us in the company parking garage appeared on a gossip business site. In it, she was laughing, and I had my hand on her elbow to steady her on the ice. The headline called it a secret romance between the Hale Group's CEO and a night janitor. By noon, the story had spread everywhere. By evening, someone had dug up my name, my job title, my salary, and the address of the house I rented. By the time I got home from work, I had been placed on administrative leave, pending review of conduct that could affect company image. Victoria showed up at my back door after dark to avoid the reporters already camped at the front. She looked exhausted and furious. I'm going to hold a press conference, she said. I'm going to tell them exactly what happened and warn them to leave you alone. I poured her a cup of tea and set it on the table. That might just make them dig harder. Then what do we do? Let them turn you into a punchline? I sat down across from her. I don't want to be humiliated, but I also don't want us to make decisions because we're scared. She looked at me for a long moment. Do you want me to walk away? To go public and say there's nothing between us? The question hung in the air between us. I met her eyes. Is that what you want? She shook her head slowly. No. I reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. Then don't. She stared at our joined hands. When she spoke again, her voice was unsteady. Do you understand how bad this could get? I do. But I helped you that night because it was the right thing to do. Whatever this has become between us, it started with the truth. I'm not going to let people who don't know either of us decide that the truth is wrong. For the first time since I had known her, Victoria let the strong, controlled expression slip. She lowered her head and I felt warm drops land on the back of my hand. She was crying. I didn't try to fix it with words. I just held her hand and let the quiet fill the kitchen while the snow started falling again outside. Whatever came next, we had already chosen not to run from it. The next morning, the Hale Group called an emergency board meeting on the 79th floor. I wasn't there, but Victoria told me every detail later, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. 16 people sat around the long glass table. None of them asked how she was feeling. They asked how much the stock had dropped, what their biggest clients were saying, and how badly the company's image had been damaged. Marcus Whitfield, the man who had wanted her seat for 2 years, led the charge. Your personal life is becoming a liability, he said. Victoria looked at him across the table. A business liability or a liability because you're uncomfortable that I'm seeing someone who doesn't belong to your social class? The room went quiet. Someone suggested she issue a statement distancing herself from me. Someone else said she should take a leave of absence to stabilize her public image. Victoria stood at the head of the table, voice calm but cold. You want me to publicly humiliate a man who helped me when I collapsed from fever in a snowstorm? You want me to call his kindness a mistake simply because he doesn't have money? No one answered immediately. That was when Richard Hale, who had been silent the entire meeting, finally spoke. He asked Victoria to step outside so the board could discuss the matter without her present. She waited in the hallway, watching snow fall against the tall windows, already preparing herself for the moment her father would tell her to choose between the company and me. When Richard came out, he didn't give her an order. He simply said, "Come with me." He took her into his private office and closed the door. For the first time in years, he talked about her mother. He told her how everyone had advised him to sell the company after his wife died and raise his daughter in peace. Instead, he had kept building, convinced that if Victoria had enough money and power and security, nothing could ever hurt her. I thought control was protection, he said. But the night you collapsed in that hallway, every system I built to keep you safe was useless. The person who helped you was someone I had never considered worthy of notice. Victoria stayed quiet. Richard placed a thick file on the desk between them. It was the full background check he had ordered on me. Every job, every address, every neighbor they had spoken to. There was nothing damaging in it. I was poor, I worked nights, I lived simply, but there were no debts I couldn't pay, no criminal record, no hidden motives. I put pressure on him, Richard said. Raised his rent, had his work scrutinized. Let people around me test whether he would use you as a shield. He didn't. He didn't ask for money, he didn't threaten to go to the press. He didn't beg you to intervene, he simply stood his ground. Victoria's hands started to shake. You turned his life into a test? Richard lowered his head. Yes, and I was wrong. It was not an easy sentence for a man like him to say. He told her that during the board meeting he had made it clear. If the directors could not separate the CEO's private life from her ability to run the company, they were free to resign. He had also made it known that anyone who attacked me because of my job or background would answer directly to him. More than that, he had realized something else. While he had spent years building walls to protect his daughter, those same walls had made it impossible for her to call him when she needed help the most. When you were burning with fever and told a stranger not to let your father know, he said, I could not pretend that meant nothing. Victoria cried then. Not from weakness, but because her father had finally seen her as more than an heir or a CEO. He had seen her as his child, While all of this was happening on the 79th floor, I was sitting in my living room watching my phone light up with messages I didn't open. The internet had already decided who I was. Some called me a gold digger. Others called me a working class fairy tale. Both versions were wrong. I hadn't helped Victoria because I wanted anything from her. I had helped her because she was a person on the floor who asked me not to leave her there. In the late afternoon, Victoria called. Her voice sounded lighter than it had in days. "My father wants to see you again." I closed my eyes. "So he can finish questioning me?" She was quiet for a second, then gave a small, tired laugh. "No, this time he wants to apologize." That evening, Richard Hale stood on my front porch holding a bottle of wine. He had come alone, without a driver or security. He still looked powerful, still looked like a man who could ruin lives with a phone call. But something in his face had shifted. He no longer looked at me like a threat that needed managing. I invited him inside. Victoria sat beside me at the kitchen table while he looked around the small room, the old table, the chipped coffee mugs. "This is where my daughter says she can finally breathe," he said. No one spoke for a moment. Then he turned to me. "Mr. Brooks, I doubted you. I applied pressure to see if you would break. That is how I deal with threats. But you are not a threat. You are the man who did the right thing when I and every system I built were not there." I looked at him. "You made my life pretty difficult." "I know, and I am sorry." I didn't forgive him right away, but I nodded. For a man like Richard Hale, those words carried more weight than any contract. He offered me a real position, paid, advising on employee welfare programs for the night shift and maintenance workers. The people who kept the buildings running but usually stayed invisible. He wanted me on the committee because I understood the problems from the inside. I looked at Victoria. She said, "It's not charity, it's actual work." I turned back to Richard. "If I do this, I'll speak plainly, even when it makes people in the room uncomfortable." The corner of his mouth moved again. "I'm beginning to think that's exactly why you need to be there." After he left, Victoria stayed. She took off her expensive coat and draped it over one of my old kitchen chairs. Then she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. "Do you still want this?" she asked. "After everything?" I stepped closer. "Do you?" "Yes." "Then so do I." When I kissed her, there was no storm outside and no fever between us. There was only the quiet understanding that what had started as one decent choice in a snowstorm had become something neither of us was willing to walk away from. 3 months later, the snow in Chicago had mostly melted. Patches of ice still clung to the shady sides of buildings, but the air had started to carry that thin, hopeful smell of coming spring. My life hadn't suddenly become easy, but it had changed. I was no longer the invisible night janitor. After the meeting with Richard, I had been moved into the facilities management department with better hours and better pay. More importantly, I had been asked to join the employee welfare advisory group he created. At first, a lot of people assumed I had been given the seat because of my relationship with Victoria. After the first few meetings, they stopped thinking that. I spoke plainly about what it was like to work nights, about the people who took buses at 2 in the morning, about health insurance that cost so much some workers avoided going to the doctor, about the break room in the basement that was worse than most storage closets. I didn't use pretty language, but I said what was true. For the first time, people on the upper floors had to listen to someone who actually cleaned their floors. Victoria was still CEO. After everything that happened, her position inside the company had actually become stronger. She had refused to let the board pressure her into throwing me under the bus. She had also started allowing herself to be tired in front of other people instead of pretending she was made of steel. Richard, for his part, had begun to change in small but noticeable ways. He no longer called Victoria at all hours to question every decision. Once or twice, he even called me directly, not to threaten, but to ask whether a new policy would actually help the night shift workers or just look good on paper. The media eventually got bored. When there was no scandal, no lawsuit, no dramatic press conference where I demanded money or Victoria resigned for love, the story stopped being interesting. The same people who had called me a gold digger slowly moved on to the next rumor. I didn't spend time trying to prove my innocence to strangers on the internet. I just kept living the way I always had, One Saturday afternoon in early spring, Victoria showed up at my house carrying 2 bags of soil and a paper sack of tulip bulbs. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair tied back low. She didn't look like the woman who appeared on the covers of business magazines. She looked like someone who was learning how to spend an ordinary afternoon. I looked at the bags. You planning to turn my front yard into a corporate strategy project? She smiled. No, this place just needs flowers. We spent the next hour planting tulips along the narrow path that led to the porch. Her hands got dirty and a nail broke, but she didn't complain. I showed her how deep to put the bulbs and how much water they needed. She listened like it was important information. When we finished, we sat on the wooden steps with glasses of lemonade. She leaned her shoulder against mine. Do you ever think that night was a mistake? She asked quietly. I watched a car drive slowly down the quiet street. Which night? The night you brought me here. If you had called security, your life would have stayed much simpler. I thought about the last 3 months. Being suspected? Having my rent raised? Being surrounded by cameras and reporters? Being suspended from work? Being pulled into a world where people had too much power and too little trust. Then I thought about Victoria laughing at my kitchen table over burnt pancakes, crying because someone finally asked what she wanted, standing beside me while the rest of the world tried to turn me into a joke. No, I said. I don't think it was a mistake. Why not? Because that night I didn't save a CEO, I just helped a person who needed help. Everything after that got complicated, but the first part stayed true. She was quiet for a while. Then she reached over and took my hand. I've lived too long in a world where everything has a price. You're the first person who made me believe some things still can't be bought or sold. I looked at her. And you made me understand that even people at the top can be lonely. She laughed softly. That doesn't sound like much of a compliment. But it's true. A few weeks later, Richard invited me to dinner at the mansion. This time, I didn't feel like I was walking into a place where I had to watch every word. During the meal, he asked me what I thought about a new housing assistance program for night shift workers. Victoria sat beside me and smiled whenever our eyes met. After dinner, Richard asked me to step into the library with him. I expected another warning or another test. Instead, he stood by the fireplace and looked at me for a long moment. I don't trust people easily, James. I noticed. The corner of his mouth moved. But I believe you love my daughter for real. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, I may not belong in her world, but what I feel for her isn't something I'm willing to bargain with. Richard nodded. Good, because Victoria has spent too many years surrounded by people who bargain with everything. A year after the night of the snowstorm, Victoria and I went back to the 78th floor of the Hale Group building. Not in secret, not in the middle of the night. It was late afternoon and the hallways were busy with people moving between meetings. We stood in the exact spot where I had found her collapsed on the marble. She looked down at the floor, then at me. I used to think that was the weakest moment of my life. Maybe it was the most honest one. She turned toward me. What if you hadn't walked by that night? I thought about it. Then I would probably still be pushing a cleaning cart, and you would still be trying to carry everything alone. She took my hand and held it tightly. And now? I looked at her and smiled. Now I'm still me. You're still you. We just aren't alone anymore. She squeezed my hand. The story people like to tell about us was the fairy tale version. The one where the poor janitor and the rich CEO found each other against all odds. That version was easy and cheap. The truth was simpler and harder. It started with one ordinary decision on a snowy night, seeing someone on the floor and choosing not to walk past them. Because of that choice, I lost the invisibility I had used to protect myself for years. Victoria lost the glass cage she had believed would keep her safe. Richard lost the belief that control was the same thing as love, and the three of us, through a lot of difficult days, found something better in its place. Trust. The tulips in front of my house bloomed in early April. Some were red, some were pink. Even though Victoria swore the bag had said all red, she said gardens sometimes like to surprise you. I told her life did the same thing. And every time the snow starts falling over Chicago again, I still think about that night on the 78th floor. The cleaning cart. The woman lying by the elevator. The choice that could have cost me my job. I didn't choose the safe thing. I chose the right thing. And the right thing led me to a life I never would have believed I deserved.